Hey everybody, Matthew here from MiniWarGaming.com, and welcome to another episode of Developer Diaries, the little show that I've created, a little short series of episodes of talking about the rules development for Ravaged, the tabletop game, the one that we are in development of. But also I want to talk more about theory crafting, like rule theories and good rule design. So if you're interested in making your own rules or you have made your own rules, then please leave comments below and what you think about what I say, especially if you disagree with what I say. But also you can leave a comment if you agree. I don't mind that as well, because it's nice for, to hear good stuff as well. Anyways, this is all part of, like I said, the development of Ravaged the game. But what I want to talk about today is universal special rules. Are they good? And, right away we can say, sure, yeah, they're good. First off, let's all get on the same page. What is a universal special rule? So a universal special rule, or a USR, as they're sometimes abbreviated to, is a rule that typically is in the main rule book that then units from almost any faction can use. For example, in Warhammer 40k, there's one that's called fly. And so just by having the word fly as one of the keywords on the unit, you know what it can do because the main rule book talks about what it can do. So a rule book does not have to have a section that says universal special rules for something to be universal. So you could theoretically say if something has a movement characteristic, that's technically a universal special rule because everybody kind of does movement the same way unless they have exceptions to that. So universal special rules are, a lot of different games use them, some more than others. Even when I look at certain games like Warhammer 40k, each edition uses them sometimes more and less. Like earlier editions of 40k use them a lot more than what you see now, but 10th edition uses them more than 9th edition did. And it's really interesting to kind of see how it goes back and forth. So the first thing is, should you use lots of universal special rules in your game development, or should you allow each faction to kind of develop their own rules? So first off, if you want to answer that question, go ahead, leave that a comment. Pause the video, leave a comment, and then you can keep watching and then pause the video again and respond to your own comment to see if I change your mind or if you want to add to your argument of one or the other. I am of the opinion that 90% of the rules that a unit receives should be universal special rules. Here's why. There's a lot of complexity in writing rules for factions. The core rules of a game can be quite simple. In fact, you can sometimes show them all on just a few pages. You can have just 4 pages of rules or 1 page of rules that tell you how the entire game works. The complexity in war games typically comes down to the units and the factions that they are part of, because that adds layers. So, for example, you have your core rules of how the game works, but then you might have a specific faction that says, but they, break the rules a little bit by doing this. Or they maybe not break the rules, but they add on to the rules by saying this. And I'll bring Warhammer 40k in here a lot because it's a popular one, so I feel like the majority of people here will understand the comparison. So we have the core rules of 40k, and they're not very complicated. They're quite elegant. We can argue about whether you like them or not, but they're still pretty straightforward. You can teach somebody how to play it rather quickly. And then you go to play let's say the Tyranids. Now the Tyranids have their own detachments, and each detachment has its own special rule, usually just one. But the faction of Tyranids has a couple special rules: Synapse and Brain. Oh yeah, and the Shadow and the Warp. And then they have their own stratagems. And then you choose a detachment, and that detachment adds 1 more rule. Now we're only talking about 3 rules now. We're talking about Synapse, Shadow and the Warp, and whatever the faction added. And so we're just adding 3 rules to the army. That adds nice flavor, but it's still more. And then you go to the individual units, and those units will have the stats, just like everybody else. They move a certain amount, they hit certain strength, and they have a certain toughness, and they have a certain armor amount, and they might have some keywords that allow them to fly or whatever. But then they'll typically have other special rules too. Some of those special rules will be shared, and there'll be what's called universal special rules, like Feel No Pain, which says whenever you get wounded, you roll a die, and on a whatever plus, you're not wounded. So that's a universal special rule. But it's also very, very full of rules that are not universal, but sometimes they're copy and paste. Like the Hormagaunts have a rule that says they can charge even if they advanced. That's a specific rule written into their card, and their data card, that's specific to their unit. But there are other units that can advance and then charge as well. And there are some stratagems, in other words, things that you can do that will allow a unit to charge even though it advanced. So the question is, at what point should it become a universal special rule rather than just written directly on the card? Now, let me just clarify something. Something can be a universal special rule and still written on the specific unit card if there's space for it. So it's like, let's call it fleet, for example. Fleet is that if you can charge when you advance. In other words, you can charge when you run. And so on the card, it can say fleet. And then in brackets, it can say you can charge even though you advanced. And the advantage of that is that if we call it something like fleet or feel no pain or fly, then when I say I have feel no pain 5+, or I have fly, most likely your opponent will be like, oh, I know what that does. If instead I say my Hormagaunts have a special rule, you could probably say this is pretty straightforward too, where they can advance and charge. You're like, okay, I understand that. That's a simple one, but there are others that get more complicated. So my Spore Mine, when he gets within 3 inches of you, he rolls a die. On a 2+, he does a mortal wound, and on a 6, he does D3 mortal wounds. Now, was that complicated? Not really. Maybe you didn't understand some of the words I said, but once you understand what a mortal wound does, you'll understand it, and of course you know what a D6 does. But what if it just had a rule called explodes, and then in brackets, whatever, like how far it goes or whatever. And that rule is also used on vehicles, and it was also used on other things, like other mines and things. But the thing is, though, as you do that, as you develop your units, what you're going to have is you're going to get a bigger and bigger and bigger list of universal special rules in your core rulebook, and to the point where it's actually quite large. In fact, Ravaged Star, at the point that I'm making this video, has, I think, around 30 or 40 universal special rules. Some of them only used on a few units. So is that a mistake? Should those be taken out, the ones that are used hardly ever, or just on a couple of units, and just baked into the unit's rules? Well, my problem with that is it doesn't really have any forward compatibility to it. What happens when we add more units, or we add more factions, and they're going to have an identical rule? At what point do I say, okay, screw it, it's a universal special rule now? And I am of the opinion that, like I said, more than 90% of the rules should be universal. And then you'll have some. And you might think, well, that doesn't allow for units to really have any flavor of their own. But I think we're kidding ourselves when we say that when we write a rule that is unique to a unit, that that makes that unit unique. Because most likely you're writing something that just is how it interacts with your current rule set. Like this thing can charge when it advances. Is that really, oh, now the Hormagaunts are super unique? Well, you know what else you could have done is just make them move faster. Like, what's the difference, really? And I know there is a difference, trust me. But now they move 8 plus D6 and they can charge. Whereas if you just made them move 12 and then they couldn't advance and charge, now it's almost the same thing. I know it's not quite, because then you could advance and get on objectives and stuff, but whatever. My point being is that what rules really make something unique that you can't find a similar version of, especially in a game like Warhammer 40k or Age of Sigmar, where they have like 15, 20 factions. How many unique rules can you really come up with for that many factions? And the other problem with coming up with more unique rules is that you don't know how they're going to interact with all of the different possibilities in the game that you're playing. So as a rules designer, as you're coming up with your rules and you're trying to figure out how to make them interact with each other, if you have an infinite permutation of these things, it can become really unwieldy. Now, the same could be said if I had lots and lots of universal special rules, like how do they all interact with each other? But at least with that, when somebody glances at a profile and sees this weapon has these 3 keywords, and they've played the game a few times, they can be like, oh, I've seen these 2, so I know what those 2. Maybe I have to look up this one. Which, by the way, they should all be in one location. Available maybe online as well, and maybe in an app that you can just click on these things and find it really quickly and be, oh, that's what that does. Reaping on an 8+ just means I get an extra hit on an 8+. Poison on an 8+ means on an 8+ I ignore their defense. Like things like that, right? It's nice and easy. We see how they interact. And that allows a rule designer to create cool, unique permutations. Well, this gun has this, this, and this. Well, this gun has those first 2, but a different one, and all of a sudden it acts differently. We don't have to write new rules for it. We can just reuse those. Every once in a while, as you come up with a new unit and you think, I want this to be able to do this, and none of those unique rules represent that, well, can we just make a new unique rule? And then you come up with that, you're like, huh, that's a cool interaction. I can see other units having that as well. And so all of a sudden, the uniqueness comes from a combination. And really, when we look at anything in life, if you're writing a story, you come up with a computer game, it's usually just the uniqueness of it is how you combine things that already exist. There's rarely like perfectly pure new ideas. Now, there are new ideas out there. Otherwise, we wouldn't have got to where we are today. Lots of new inventions wouldn't exist. But the vast majority of us who are creating things and beautiful things and wonderful things are really just combining things that we've already seen or already heard about. And we find ways that kind of work with our emotions, work with our purposes, and that is still creation. And I don't have a problem with that. I think that's actually a beautiful part of the human experience, is learning from each other and then combining all these different things into something new and beautiful. And same thing, I'm really getting kind of super philosophical right here, but I say the same thing goes for rule design, that the complexity is not so much that everything is written in a complex way, but the complexity comes from the sum of its parts. So having something have two, this thing has these two universal special rules, this thing has this one, and this one has these three, and these ones have three as well, but different than those three. But one of them, they share one of them, but then it's two different. Each unit, you can kind of, you have a tool set almost of being like, okay, I've got a new unit, let's grab something. All right, we got this guy. Well, looks like he's got some sort of Gatling cannon on his right hand. So, well, how should Gatling cannons work? Well, first off, I've done Gatling cannons before, but this is the first time. Well, Gatling cannons are going to fire really fast. Well, I've got a rule that kind of works for that, where something's not like perfectly accurate, but it's fast. It's called reaping, where if you roll high enough, you do more hits. So, and the Gatling cannon should totally have that. And you can kind of keep going with things like that. Oh, on the other side, it looks like some sort of laser. So it's only a single shot, but that looks like it should be really good against tanks. So I'm not going to write a rule that says if it hits a tank, it does this. I'll just give it anti-armor 8+, which says on an 8+ when it hits against targets that are armored, which typically are monsters and vehicles, that it ignores their defense. And it looks like it's very precise. And so I'll give it the sniper rule, which ignores distance penalty. So it can be like a sniping laser. I don't know if I'd do that for this guy in particular, just giving examples of how things could work. And so by having that tool set of these ready-made universal special rules, you can just copy and paste them over and be like, this is what it does. And because you're using the same ones over and over again, just in different permutations, you can kind of know what to expect in terms of their power output and how well they're going to work. So I guess I've spent this video not exploring all the different options, but really trying to talk about why I think universal special rules are the bee's knees, why they're so awesome, and why I think every miniature wargame out there should basically build their game around them rather than trying to have everything be stupidly unique within their own game. The uniqueness comes from the permutations rather than from every unit having to come up with something new. And that way, if you have multiple people working on the rules as well, and you kind of come up with this system of how the rules interact with each other, you don't have to worry about somebody going off the wires and making something too powerful. Now, obviously, points and force organization is going to have a play in that, because somebody could just be like, well, I'll just put these 17 keywords on this guy and now he does everything. Sure. So obviously things can still get out of hand for balance. So I'm not saying this fixes all the balance issues out there. It more fixes like all those unexpected interactions, because over time you get used to what these different rules do, and so therefore shouldn't have those. So I think that's all I got to say. I'm just looking at the time and how long I've been rambling on. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave those in the comments below of whether you think universal special rules are really good, how much they're good, like should a game really be developed all around them, or should it just be a few of them? I want to hear all of that. Also, Ravaged Star, the game, is a campaign that we're running on GameFound. Probably by the time I put this video out, it's already live. I'll put links down below. You can also access the rules to Ravaged Star, the early alpha rules, and you can have a big hand in playtesting and getting the feedback. I'll put a Discord link where they're available, as well as links to other playtest battle reports. Leave comments places. I will monitor everything, pretty much everything, and I won't reply to everything because that would be ridiculous and it would be it'd take way too much time. But I am trying to take as much feedback in and trying to find all those gems of ideas and then just soak them up and borrow them and put them into my game. And so we can make Ravaged Star the game the best thing ever for what it needs to be specifically. Thanks for watching. This is Matthew from MiniWarGaming. Happy wargaming.